session now, and we'll make that available later. I had a few requests for people who couldn't attend tonight to potentially see a recording. So we'll start by, I'll share my screen and hopefully you can all see the slide deck. So my name is Mike Slynn. I'm a member of the Liberal Democrats in the South Richmond ward, and I've just been asked to chair this session, and it's a special ward meeting of both North Richmond and South Richmond, and my main purpose is to introduce Keith. So we have Keith Sharp with us, who is the Vice Chair of Liberal Democrats for Electoral Reform. He's also a member of the Make Vote Matters Alliance, a former elected council member of the Electoral Reform Society, and a former Liberal Democrat councillor and parliamentary candidate. So Keith is going to take us through a series of slides and information about the whole topic of electoral reform. And the real reason for this session was that electoral reform was one of the things that came up in some of our ward meetings about what we could do locally, and what were some of the priorities that Liberal Democrats should focus on. So really this is an education session for everyone here, and there'll be people on the call who know an awful lot about this topic and some that maybe know very little. And at the end, we'll have a question and answer session. So if you have any questions as we go along, feel free to submit those using the chat function, and I can collate those as we go. But then there will also be an open verbal question and answer session at the end. So submit any questions on chat during the actual call, or we will hand over and open all the microphones up near the end. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Keith.
Thank you, Mike, and good evening, everyone. Sorry, Mike, could we go back to the first slide? I just want to say a word or two about LDER, if we could.
Sure.
Firstly, I'm based in Islington in North London, and I was indeed a councillor in Islington, a parliamentary candidate in Islington. Sadly, those were the days when we had councillors in Islington. We haven't managed to sustain leadership and power the way that you have in Richmond. But my experience as a councillor was on Islington Council when the Liberal Democrats were in the majority. I just wanted to say a word really about Liberal Democrats for Electoral Reform, which may or may not be familiar to people. It is a recognised and established AO, associate organisation, within the party. And that means it is recognised, it has party members, we charge subscription. Sorry, all members of LDER are members of the Liberal Democrats. We do have a supporters base, which perhaps goes a little wider than that. But we're properly recognised, we function as an organisation, we're not just a Facebook page and a couple of people. So we present annual accounts to the party. We have an AGM, and not quite sure how we're going to do that this year because it normally takes place at Autumn Conference. And we have annual elections, or at least vacancies for elections if people want to stand for the executive of LDER. So that's us. We've got a mailing list of, and Helen will correct me perhaps, but we've got a mailing list in excess of about 1,000 people, not all paid up members, but at least on our distribution list. And therein actually lies sorry, I think I was just muted there. Am I back now?
You are, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. We always have an exhibition stall at conferences. We are looking to, we nearly did a fringe meeting in York. Obviously, York didn't happen, but we're looking to rerun that if we can in September. Nevertheless, we probably reach around, a couple of thousand of the 100,000 members of the Liberal Democrats. And our challenge as LDER is to reach across and get across to as many party members as possible. Now, as proportional representation is party policy, what do we exist to do? We don't have to persuade people as such. And there's two main things. One is to educate and inform as best we can party members about electoral reform and how we're going to get it done. And the other task that we have, as well as reaching the members, trying to update and inform, is to get the policy high on the party's agenda. Now, there's a couple of challenges in both of those, which is that, as we know, most members of the party have joined since around 2015. They most likely did not join because of electoral reform. They probably joined because of Europe or related issues. And my take is that a lot of party members have a general notion about electoral reform or know that it's kind of a good thing, and maybe know that Liberal Democrats get cheated at general elections because we don't get the seats that our proportion of the vote would suggest that we should have, but don't have much knowledge of it beyond that. And I hope to sort of share some of the beyond that aspects with you this evening. And the other thing about getting it high on the party's agenda, the party has been very shy about electoral reform since the 2011 AV referendum. And I'm very pleased that there's been signs of a revival of seeing electoral reform as a priority, not least of which with the appointment of our first frontbench spokesperson for goodness knows how long on political constitutional reform, and that's Wendy Chamberlain. I'm very pleased to say that we've already had LDER a couple of exchanges with her, and there does seem to be a good line of communication there. I just add as well that although we are an AO and we comply with the requirements, doesn't mean we have instant access to consultation on these things. In fact, we have to sort of jump up and down and work quite hard to get noticed. And it does feel a bit of a step forward at the moment. I'll say a bit more about Wendy as we go through. And finally, before we really get underway, most of what I'll be talking about tonight is party policy, LDER policy. I may veer off that into personal speculation, particularly if we get into Q&As. So most of this is going to be party policy. Some of it may be my own take on things. So please bear with me on that. I don't want Helen or other members of LDR saying, "What on earth are you talking about?" when it comes to it. So those are the introductions. Thank you very much for that. So we can go on to the next slide. Okay, here's the problem. And I was very pleased at I think Mike picked the title for this talk, A System That Cheats the Voter, because it's the plight of the voter that we want to focus on. But here is the ridiculous and distorted situation that we face as a so-called democracy. And I really have doubts at the extent to which Britain truly is a democracy. All you've got here is a simple bar chart of taking the number of votes that each party received and dividing that by the number of seats that they won. And you can see that it was amazingly easy for the SNP to win seats, pretty easy for the other two main parties, and increasingly difficult if you are a so-called smaller party, such as ourselves or the Greens. So that's how it looks graphically. If you just move to the slide now, it gives you the actual stats. You can see here the gross distortions and the way in which voters get cheated. Because the SNP has a close geographic concentration of seats, i.e. Scotland, they don't have to get that many votes to win seats. So you go from 25,000 down to the absurd level where the Greens had to get 865,000 votes to get Caroline Lucas elected. And the Brexit Party, I don't often shed tears for them, but look, they got 644,000 votes and no MPs whatsoever. And as Wendy Chamberlain pointed out in a speech last week, actually, the biggest impact the Brexit Party had on the election was not standing, was withdrawing candidates. As we know, they pulled out and gave Johnson his 80-odd seat majority. But what a denial of democracy, that the best way to impact an election result is to deny choice to the voters. Mystery though it is to me, There were probably thousands of people who wanted to vote for the Brexit Party in some of those seats, and they were denied the opportunity to do so. You have to do this under the present electoral system. We've done it. We've done it in Richmond. I think I'm right in saying that if you were a Green in Richmond, you couldn't vote for the Greens in the last general election, and that makes absolute electoral and tactical sense under the system that we have. If that is the game, you have to be able to play the game, and so it was quite right that the Greens stood down, and I think Sarah would probably have won anyway, but let her through. Similarly, how unfortunate that the only way to play this system is for Liberal Democrats in Brighton Pavilion to be denied the choice and the voice of voting for the party they actually support. So what a denial of democracy we're confronting here. And that chart really sums it up all very well. And I thought Wendy's observation about withdrawing, having more impact on the result than standing was very, very important on that. So we can continue on to the next slide. I'm grateful to the Electoral Reform Society for this. Electoral Reform Society is an absolute mine of very authentic information. And we're talking about voiceless voters, which is what Wendy Chamberlain has been talking about. We're talking about cheated, wasted votes. And you see here how this panned out. And perhaps the most interesting point there is a third bullet point down, which people often don't think about, which is that, no, I'm sorry, it's the fourth one down, sorry, the 8.1 million votes, which are surplus. Now, of course, every MP likes to have a nice big majority. It makes her or him feel, secure, safe, and all the rest of it. But for the voter, it actually means that a lot of those votes get wasted. Sad to say, from my point of view, in my part of North London, the Labour Party builds up majorities of 30,000 in seats around here. And the point here is that just building up an endless surplus also effectively disenfranchises voters, because if you're a Labour voter in Islington North, which is where I live, and Labour's going to win by 20, 30,000 votes anyway, your vote doesn't really have much of an impact on the result. And so if you look at my vote in Islington North, which of course was wasted because we're never going to elect a Liberal Democrat in Islington, well, at least no, not in the foreseeable future. But if you also look at the meaningless surpluses that are built up, you get to the staggering situation where 70% of the votes cast didn't actually contribute to making a difference to electing one candidate as opposed to another. And so, again, the waste and the wasted votes that happens here, I hope we're beginning to see, if we weren't already on this, that it's not just a question of did my party get the seats in proportion to the votes that were cast for us. The real issue is around the voter and how the voter is frustrated, disenfranchised, made voiceless, to quote Wendy again, time after time in general elections. And the 2019 general election was not untypical. It's pretty, I mean, obviously it varies a bit election to election, but the wasted votes and the cheating of the voters is serial in this country. Thanks, Mike. So let's carry on along. Every government since 1945 has been elected with less than half of the votes cast. There is a note there that the 23% that we got and the 56% that the Conservatives got put together actually did make a majority in 2010. But all these single party, strong party governments that have been rammed down my throat, at least, for a very long time, are actually a misnomer, because they are based on a minority vote. Everyone, Blair in 97, everyone you can think, Blair had about 43 or 44% of the vote in 1997. So the outcome of the election is really a lottery. It's really guesswork. You probably also know that there have been occasions when the party which got the most votes didn't win the election. That was true of the Conservatives in February 1974, not in October, but in February 1974. And the one I always think of is, if you go back to 1951, word is that the Labour Party under Clement Attlee was exhausted, run out of steam. In that election, Labour got the biggest single vote in terms of numbers of votes cast of any party in any election since the war. So actually, Labour was more popular in 1951 than it was in 1945, but the first past the post electoral system denied that, skewed that, and what came in, you may have opinions of it, I was just about conscious then, 13 years, I remember my father talking about 13 years of Tory misrule from 1951, an election that in terms of the popular vote, they actually lost. So if you look at the distortions in the recent election, you can see it all there, well under half the votes for the Conservatives and 56.2% of the seats. I will put in a word in defence of the SNP here. I'm not a home ruler for Scotland, but I do appreciate the fact that although the SNP win out big time from first past the post, they are adamant that first past the post is a bad idea, and to the extent that they will be involved in Westminster elections, they want to see proportional representation for Westminster, knowing that it means they will get less, or presumably, if the voting patterns remain the same, they will get less seats than they would have had had they kept with first past the post. So that's a very good example of a party that you can't accuse of self-interest in wanting electoral change. But you can see there, actually Labour was fairly proportionate. That's pretty random and quite unusual. But you can see the key thing there, that Johnson and his cronies are parading around with this big majority, well less than half the people voting for them. And in terms of another issue I feel very, very strongly about, it gets even worse. If we could just hop onto the next slide, which is that the general election of 2019 returned a majority of people in favour of a second referendum on European Union membership. Just look at it there. You add them up. Those who are against a final say, Tories and Brexit got 46% of the vote, and pro-final say. Now, I know the Liberal Democrats are talking about revoke, but we actually had the twin policy of revoke had we won the general election, but people's vote, final say referendum, if we did not win the general election, were in a mix of parties that were able to campaign or put through a second referendum. So you have there actually a fairly clear, I mean, like 4 points, a bit like the referendum in 2016, but the other way. And yet, of course, all that gets swept aside, and it makes me sad. I'm not saying there's anything we can do about it in practical terms. It makes me sad to listen, as I was, to a European movement rally on Monday, where people were saying, well, of course, we do have to accept the British people have voted to leave the European Union, blah, blah, blah. Well, they haven't. But the electoral system fixes it so that it looks as though we have, and we're now stuck with Johnson and his appalling behaviour over the European Union, as well as a number of other things. I just wanted to put that point. That's my extrapolation from the Electoral Reform Society figures, but I think you'll see that they pretty much add up. So what is our policy on electoral reform? So that's the problem. I mean, I find it increasingly difficult to believe, apart from naked self-interest, people can sit through the stats that we've just shared and think that there is not a problem. But what would we do about it? And I'll start out with a quote from the 2019 General Election Manifesto. Well, you can see it there. Proportional representation, single transferable vote for electing MPs and local councillors in England. So that is actually our long-standing policy. And while this need not be a debate tonight about systems, some more points to make about that as we go through about how to handle that rather thorny topic. There is a reason that as Liberal Democrats, we support single transferable vote. It is because it is the system which gives the most power and the most voice and choice to the voter. In other words, single transferable vote supports a democracy, whereas first past the post and frankly some other PR systems support what I like to call a partyocracy. It's to the convenience of the parties and the political organizations, not the individual voters. And as liberals who believe in the power, if not the sovereignty of the individual, it is entirely logical and rational that we support single transferable vote because it gives equality to the voter, all votes count equally, and that in turn leads to proportionality of the parties. I mean, if the voters' views are being properly represented and accurately reflected in the composition of the parliament or the council or the assembly, then the proportionality of party seats will happen as a matter of course. So that is our policy. The sad thing was it's shoved away on page 83, but there you go. And that has been the long-standing policy of ourselves and our predecessor parties, the SDP and the Liberals. But there's more to it than that. And this is where it gets quite interesting. We are also signatories to the Good Systems Agreement, and Make Votes Matter is pro-PR system neutral. They do not advocate this, AMS, STV system. What they have done, and you can have a good click on the link and have a read, is to say, what would a good system look like? What would it do? What would it mean for our society, our democracy, and for the voters? And this could well prove to be, if we get to it, an astute way of sidestepping the clash that could otherwise happen between the Liberal Democrats who support STV, let's say Labour, who support the additional member system, like the one for Germany, or for the Parliament in Scotland. The Labour Party is not fully signed up to the Good Systems Agreement. Individuals within the Labour Party are, and so that could be a good basis for resolving what sort of electoral system do we want to replace first past the post. So that's the second element of our policy. We then move to the third point there, citizens' assemblies and juries, possibly a constitutional convention. You might actually call number 3 not a referendum. How do we get change without the, the precedent of a referendum being foisted on us with all of the vagaries and drawbacks and so on that we know about that? The point is, the thinking is, that if we are able to form a coalition or some alliance arrangement after a general election, that without sacrificing STV up front, we would put the Good Systems Agreement into place and go to citizens' assemblies, citizens' juries, to let the people work out what they think is the best system for voters and citizens of the UK. And we would be in there pushing STV, but we recognize there has to be a way of resolving this that isn't just I want my system, you want your system. And frankly, with only 11 seats, at the present count at least, we would be pretty hard put to foist our views over on the Labour Party if it ever came to that. And there is a charity called Involve, which specializes in deliberative democracy. Make Votes Matter and the Electoral Reform Society have been working with them as well, so there's some points there. I was saying earlier, though, that we can't do it on our own. And cross-party working is the key. And there's a number of ways that could happen. There's the way Cook-McLennan was put together when Blair and Ashdown were working together in the 90s. There was the Unite for Remain, which obviously you have first-hand experience of in a way that I don't. I think it was 61 seats for the general election. And Unite to Remain has morphed into Unite to Reform. And I think they've only got a Facebook page at the moment, but it's linked there. And apart from anything else, there is a terrific speech by Labour's Clive Lewis. He talks about the 3 M's, morality, modernity, and maths, as justification for changing the electoral system. So there may be a forum there for cross-party working. I'd like to say a word, though, about Labour, because it does need reform in practical terms, does need one of the two main parties to come over to electoral reform, or at least be open enough to it to incorporate it into some kind of citizens' assembly or constitutional convention. And it ain't going to be the Conservatives, so it's going to be anybody, it's going to be Labour. Now, obviously, Starmer is pretty new. I have to say, I would have loved to have seen Clive Lewis as the leader of the Labour Party. I think there are other reasons within Labour why that wasn't going to happen. But Starmer seems to be the next best bet. And we don't know what Starmer thinks. One of the discussions we have with our electoral reform colleagues in the Labour Party around what Labour is doing, somebody put it to me quite graphically, which is that Starmer has won the leadership, he now has to win the Labour Party. All the factions and divisions and tribes within the Labour Party, he's got to win that over, win all those factions over. And so they were saying, you know, you're probably looking at 2022 or 2023 before he comes out with anything as potentially splitting and controversial as proportional representation. So I think we have to watch this space. We have to think about how we as a party behave towards other parties, particularly the Labour Party, as things evolve over the next couple of years. For me, I find it blindingly amazing that there are people in the Labour Party, just from the self-interest point of view, who seem to think that Buggins' turn still operates and, you know, they'll win the next election really. And doubtless Starmer's popularity at the moment is convincing them of that. Stats are that between 45 and 79, time in office was pretty much shared by Labour and the Conservatives, about 17 years each. Assuming Johnson's still in 2024, by 2024, the Conservatives will have been in power for 32 of the 45 years between 79 and 24. So there are some things for Labour to really resolve and ask itself. As far as the Liberal Democrats are concerned, and Wendy Chamberlain was good enough to confirm this in this discussion we had with her recently, we make our pitch for change on the plight of the voter. We're not likely to get too many crocodile tears from people if we just complain that we're not getting our fair share. We have to talk about the voiceless voter, the plight of the voter, and this is something we're going to work on doing over the next 2 years. Wendy sees 2023, assuming 2024 is a general election, as the time for motions to conference around anything like committing to work with other parties or red lines in negotiations, should we get to that after a general election. And that might actually fit the kind of timing that Starmer's Labour Party might be facing as well. As I say, I got that from a couple of people in the Labour campaign for electoral reform who are essentially on our wavelength, if not on our side. Okay, yes, we can move on, Mike, thanks. So that's all very good, but how do we get change, and how do we address the issue of the voter? Anybody who's campaigned for electoral reform will have found that if you turn up bright and breezily on the doorstep and say, hey, you know what you need is proportional representation, you will very often get a kind of a sort of, sounds good, but what people are really interested in is health service, jobs, nowadays the environment, and so on and so forth. So what is our starting point for voter dissatisfaction? And those stats there, I think, sum it up pretty well. I won't read them out, you can see them there. But it shows that a majority of the people in this country don't like the way our democracy works. Some other things that we may be able to consider, we discussed this with Wendy, obviously linking COVID-19 to electoral reform is a little tenuous and you have to be careful, but it is a fact that countries where there is a secure democratic electoral system, unlike this country, have done better at dealing with COVID-19 than other countries. I'll quote Denmark, where I listened to a Danish MP saying, well, you know, obviously we have different political parties, but the reason we've been able to deal with this as a society is that fundamentally, whatever the political complexion, most Danish people trust the intentions of the government. And in turn, the government intrinsically trusts the good sense and the intentions of most of the voters. I mean, and think of how that would have helped deal with COVID-19, and think of the contrast between that quote about Denmark and what we face in the UK. So the point is that while voters aren't leaping up and down and saying, yes, we want a different voting system, there is clear evidence there of dissatisfaction. And there is also evidence that once people have got PR systems, they're either like them and they don't want to give them up. I could quote you New Zealand and indeed Scotland about that. So what we need to be able to do is to tap into that dissatisfaction, and we need to show ways in which we can link electoral reform to actual change and people's lives. And I'll just finish, if we can just move to the next slide, I'll finish up on that. So what can we do? Well, I'll tell you one thing that's happening, and I think it's potentially quite exciting. Next Monday, 22nd of June, the Green Liberal Democrats having some sort of online conference. I don't know if any members of the GLD, but we've arranged for Wendy and Kleiner Jordan, who is the co-founder of Make Votes Matter, to join the Green Liberal Democrats and spokespeople to talk about the relationship between electoral reform and getting progressive environmental policies into place. There is good evidence that where you have a proportional system, it is easier for environmental policies to get actioned. And so if we can start that process by what I've just said, by linking policy change to a change in the electoral system, that could be very exciting. And I'm quite looking forward to see what comes out of next Monday. And if that works out, we can perhaps go to other associated organizations within the Liberal Democrats as well. So that's one thing that we're doing. What can we do as local people? Well, please join Liberal Democrats for Electoral Reform. We could use the help. You can see our details there. And two excellent organizations, Electoral Reform Society and Make Votes Matter. You can join the Electoral Reform Society as a member. You can stand for council. Make Votes Matter is not a sort of an elected constitutional type organization, but you can sign up as a supporter. And Make Votes Matter, when we don't have a pandemic, are very, very effective at a grassroots level in getting things going. Just continuing on along, you may be aware, or you may not be aware, that Make Votes Matter does have a London Southwest branch. Now in Islington, we had a good meeting with the Make Votes Matter North London group, and if Catherine's on the call, she was there too, and she is the East London Make Votes Matter organizer. So, sorry, that wasn't supposed to happen. And so I've lost the, sorry, I've lost the, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So the other things that we can do, and I can't see the slide, I'm afraid. So I'll have to just try to remember what we said. There are other things that you can do. So Keith, I don't know why I've lost the slides.
I'll stop sharing and then I'll share again and see if that picks it up.
I don't know whether that phone call I got knocked it out. We're nearly done. There's only a couple of slides to, probably on about slide 9.
Can you see it now?
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, we were just talking about the liaison that we've had from the Islington Liberal Democrats with Make Votes Matter. But for the pandemic, we were looking with Make Votes Matter at holding a sort of public forum meeting in North London, get a major speaker along, an MP or a national leader of Make Votes Matter, and probably get 40 or 50 people along to it, promoted it hard, and obviously social media it, get the press invited, so on and so forth. So finding out like-minded organizations in your area, and Make Votes Matter is probably the best example, but there may be others as well. So there's that, and then I think the last slide, Mike, is, yeah, what could we do? Who are the local stakeholder groups in your area? And having run the council to the extent that you have, and having the councillors and the MPs that you have, you will doubtless have great inroads into the networking, the communities and the stakeholder groups. But look at those sections of our society that suffer from underrepresentation, and part of the reason they suffer from underrepresentation is the electoral system. You can make too easy a jump on that, but nevertheless, if you look at countries where proportional systems are in place, you will see much better representation of women and of minorities as well. The other thing you can look to do is to promote electoral reform in your leaflets, in the materials that you do. We're not suggesting it's going to be a headline topic, but Wendy Chamberlain is making some very powerful speeches now. And if we're very clever, LDER that is, we should be able to feed information across to interested local parties. So snippets from Westminster about electoral reform. What Wendy is trying to do in Parliament is to make electoral reform part of the conversation, not the lead story necessarily, but in there, part of the narrative, part of what is being discussed, so that if and when we have the chance to introduce electoral reform after a general election, it's not kind of being hooked out of some old archive somewhere, it's part of the currency. And the last thought for you, controlling the council as you do, is something we did do in Islington when we ran the council, which was put a motion to the council that in the interest of local democracy, the people of Richmond would be better served by adoption for local elections, single transferable vote. We do now have the example of Scotland, which has happened. I was lucky enough to be an election observer in 2007 when Scotland first used STV for local government. And Scotland has had now the twin arrangement of AMS for Parliament and STV for local government for some time. And so a motion such as that going to council would be entirely in harmony with the experience that we've had north of the border. So we did think it'd be helpful to finish up this part of the discussion with a few points around what can people actually do. And I hope those last two slides give you a few thoughts. And thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Keith. Really interesting stuff there. So everyone on the call, feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like to ask any questions. You should be able to do that. And I don't think there was any that came in on the chat, but maybe I'll kick off with one. It's an interesting point that the Scottish local government uses STV. I was wondering if you could give us a little bit of information about how that came about and whether there's any lessons there in terms of us focusing on STV for local government first as a stepping stone to Westminster, rather than trying to crack the nut of the proportionality for Westminster.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point. There is a school of thought which says that in 2010 we shouldn't have thrown ourselves all over AV, but said no referendum, no nonsense, STV for local elections in England immediately, please. Because that was how it was done in Scotland. Obviously, there was a referendum in Scotland, but that was about devolution in total. And the way things started out, if I remember correctly, was that there was AMS for the Scottish Parliament and first past the post for local government. And the adoption of STV for local government came about purely through a Lib Lab coalition. If you think back, the first government in Scotland under devolution in 99 was a Lib Lab coalition. And the great Jim Wallace, the Liberal Democrats lead in the Scottish government there, I think it was Henry McConnell was the leader for Labour at the time, although I may be wrong on that. They got together, they negotiated, and they agreed that they agreed that proportionality should operate at local government level as well as at Holyrood level in the terms of Scotland. And it was agreed that that change would be made, and it would be done by introducing STV. There are various reasons why STV is particularly suitable for local government, not least of which you already have multi-member wards. And so you can introduce it relatively simply. So it was done through a coalition government, it was done through negotiation, and there clearly we would have done better in retrospect to have pushed for STV for local government in 2010 rather than an AV referendum. In fairness, Nick Clegg and others, there was a huge push at the time to sort out Westminster, and going for local government would have seemed like a miserable little compromise. Well, irony has it, but that was essentially how it came. And there will be a discussion to be had. I mean, I mentioned red lines. I think the mood at the moment is, after all the horrors of the last few years and the horrors of the next few years coming up, we need to fix Westminster, but maybe some sort of fallback position or a part of the package would be STV for local government in England. Incidentally, we have it in Scotland. In Wales, there is a move at the moment taking place. I'm not sure it's quite been concluded yet, but we may very well see STV being introduced to local government in Wales as well.
That's an interesting point. So is that believed to be possible through the Welsh Assembly route to change the voting system within Wales?
That's a good question, and I'm on slightly thin ice here. They have had a long ongoing consultation around the introduction of, well, various changes of votes at 16, various changes that they want to introduce in Wales. And you see, Scotland could do it, but Scotland's a parliament. Wales is only an assembly. I'm not sure if Wales has the powers to do it. If anybody is stronger on the constitution than I am, please step in. Scotland as a parliament could do it. I'm not sure Wales as an assembly can. They've been through quite a rigorous process of negotiation and public consultation. And I think they're due to move to some sort of a decision during the course of this year. It's probably been held up by the pandemic like everything else, but that is on the cards. And I think there's a very strong, case for introducing STV for local government. As I say, we have the precedent of Scotland. And, if it has to be the domino effect rather than one big swooshing revolution, then once people start seeing how sensible STV is at local government level, they might start questioning what on earth is this barbaric Stone Age system that we're stuck with at Westminster.
Can I come at this point? Keith,
okay.
You've focused very much on the central government level, and you mentioned the local government level as well, but in between the two, you've got the sort of regional government level. And in London at the moment, we do have representation on the GLA Assembly, and that's through a decent democratic system. And the Greens have a representation on that assembly as well. But there's the other level that you haven't mentioned, and I guess it's because we're out of it now, but there was a European level, and that was similarly democratic. But what we saw was an unfortunate result where UKIP grabbed 24 seats. I can only think that's because there are not many people who are interested in voting in the European elections. And the turnout was low, so UKIP walked with it. Do you have any comment on that?
Well, first, I'm not actually a great fan of the system we had for the European election because it was a closed list, and it prevents any kind of link between voters and the people being elected. You could say that for relatively few, I think it's 89 we had, wasn't it? Relatively few seats across the whole country, that's acceptable. But I would have preferred to see open lists whereby voters for a certain party could choose their preferred candidates out of the list rather than having to accept the list that was being handed down to them. Look, as far as UKIP and the Brexit Party, for that matter, are concerned, you know what? Hate to say this, if they're going to get millions of people voting for them, they probably deserve to have some seats. And to me, one of the failures has been to try and shut UKIP out and even shut the Brexit Party out. It was a bit late. I think that the UKIP lot and also Brexit was so awful and so useless once you got beyond Nigel Farage, which if you think about him, he is effective, that once they were exposed to public scrutiny, they fell to bits because there was nothing there. And I think we shot ourselves in the foot by trying to exclude them and trying to disenfranchise them. And you look, frankly, as I said, if 20% of the people are, in my opinion, foolish enough, who am I to say, if 20% of the people vote for UKIP, UKIP deserve to get some seats. You don't beat that kind of right-wing nationalism, whatever you want to call it, by trying to suppress it. And probably, you know, if UKIP had been able to get people elected, we'd have found out what they were like, and they wouldn't have been able to be as effective as they were in the referendum in 2016. But the basic answer to your question is if people vote that way, we have to respect that and put them in, you know, let their representatives go into the assembly or the parliament or whatever it is. There is, incidentally, quite a lot of evidence. The Electoral Reform Society did some very good work on this 10 years or so ago, that first past the post actually fuels and supports the likes of the BNP, certainly in local council elections, because you've got very low turnout and you can win seats with only 29% of the vote. So you only need a few hundred people to get your councillors elected. So it's not quite as simple as saying, oh, if it's proportional, all those lowlifes will get some seats. It operates the other way as well. It depends how you game the system.